Hi, it's Beth here. Okay, it's episode 256, October 3rd. I'm still over 65 and I'm still talking. And I gotta stop watching Turner Classic Movies. I did it again. I can't believe it. What was I thinking? This time I watched The Graduate. Oh my God. That's not romantic. It's a nightmare. An absolute nightmare. When she's on the bus at the end of the movie, sitting next to this twerp that slept with her mother, I feel so sorry for Elaine. I'm like, how could this movie have ever been made? So I looked it up. It was a book, of course, and it was panned. So this one guy named Lawrence Terman, whose father was in the garment industry, he wanted to break into Hollywood. He bought the rights for $1,000, which was nothing back then. He gave it to his friend Brian Keith, who, you know, he's not a very famous guy. He was the guy who was in that TV show with the twins, the redheaded twins, Mrs. Beasley, that little doll. That's his biggest thing. But he had a nose. He could tell when something was great. So Lawrence gives him the script. Keith reads it, and there's a role in it for him, of course, to be the father, Benjamin's father. Okay, so he reads it and he says, listen, I gotta tell you the truth. This was the biggest pile of bat guano I have ever read. So Lawrence didn't take that as any sort of a problem, and he went looking for a director. So he found Mike Nichols, who actually wasn't famous yet for directing. He'd been in a comedy act with Elaine May, and he read it and he said, it's horrible, but I'm intrigued. And so Lawrence said, good, I'll take that. And so they gave it to this guy named Calder Willingham, a screenwriter. He needed the work. He hated the script. He hated the book. He said the whole thing about a young man marrying a girl after screwing her mother's ears off her head is a mess. So he said, but I need the money. And Lawrence couldn't get anybody else to do a treatment or a screenplay or anything. No one wanted to be associated with this story. So I'm kind of vindicated. It was that bad. So then a couple of years go by. Mike Nichols gets very, very famous, does 3 great plays on Broadway. And then he does Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and nabs Elizabeth Taylor another Oscar. So now he is famous, and he still wants to do this book because it intrigues him, and he doesn't know why. And he thinks it's a sickness in him, but he cannot stop it. So he gives the script to Buck Henry, who's never written a script. That's the kind of person you had to give this book to because, you know, and that script, that horrible script, because nobody wanted their name associated with it. Well, Buck Henry did, and he also needed the money. He was a first-class comedian. He ramped up the comedy in it. He made a silk purse out of a sow's ear, although it was still a disgusting story, and a lot of people were shying away from it. They went to so many people. Well, Robert Redford had heard about it from Mike Nichols and read the book because they did Barefoot in the Park together on Broadway. He wanted to play the role, desperately wanted to be this guy. And so Mike was not like, no, you can't. So he rams into his office and he says, I want the role. And you could hardly say no to Robert Redford at the time. He was coming way up. Mike looks at him. He looks him up and down. He's really feeling sorry for him. And he says, look, you can't play it. You can never play a loser. Robert looks at him and he says, what in God's name do you mean by that? Of course I can play a loser. Nichols just sits him in a chair and he says, okay, listen, Bob, have you ever struck out with a girl? Bob looks at him and goes, what do you mean struck out? Mike has him escorted out of the building. That's the end of Robert Redford. But Mike has this crazy wish list. For Ben, it's Warren Beatty, Steve Martin, George Papard, George Hamilton, Tony Perkins, I don't see that, or Anthony Quinn, and I don't see that. For Elaine, he has Natalie Wood, Anne Margaret, Jane Fonda, Tuesday Weld, Suzanne Plachette, Carol Lindley, Patty Duke, and I do not see that, or Haley Mills. Nobody wants it. No one wants to be associated with this terrible story. I mean, I don't even think there was a word for pedophilia, but none of these girls, none of these guys wanted to be associated with this story. Anne Bancroft did. She wanted to play Mrs. Robinson because she knew she could play it. So that was all taken care of. He did not have to worry about that. Mike Nichols goes screaming into Lawrence's office, and he says, "Lawrence, you SOB, you got me into a movie that can't be cast. There's nobody." So finally, he's so desperate. There's this kid named Dustin Hoffman in New York, and he's working in the toy department at Macy's, and he moonlights as an attendant in a psychiatric hospital. Sometimes he's worked off Broadway. He's a quirky kid. Mike goes, "Bring him to LA. Let me look at him. I'm desperate." Dustin flies to LA. He doesn't really want to do this. He'd left LA. He'd been raised in LA. He felt like everybody was anti-Semitic and they hated Jewish people. He ran by himself to New York as soon as he could. So there he is. He shows up at the office, and he can't walk in. He goes down the street, calls up Mike. He says, "Listen, Mike, I just don't see it. I mean, this role, I read the book on the plane again. This role is for a genteel, Robert Redford, waspy, Boston Brahmin part, not for me." Mike says, "Listen, Dustin, this character is Jewish on the inside." Dustin listens to Michael Igor Peskowski. That's Mike Nichols' name. He was from Russia, too. He said, "He's Jewish on the inside. You can do this like nobody else." So he comes inside the building. For the audition, they have gotten Catherine Ross. She's sitting across from him, all tan, looking at him like he was something the cat dragged in. That's what he said. Pale as a ghost. He looked like a vampire next to her. He's like, "This is a nightmare." Catherine Ross was 24 years old. She wanted the role really badly. The only thing she'd ever played before this was Jimmy Stewart's daughter-in-law in Shenandoah. Not a big part. Dustin looked at her, though, at Catherine Ross, and he said, "Why? Why did the director connect him with her? She's gorgeous." He thought it was an even uglier joke that he was standing next to her because she overpowered him. He said this was a Jewish nightmare and he wanted to leave again. Mike comes out. He goes, "Listen, Dustin, go to makeup. I'll pay you twice as much. Go to makeup. Put some makeup on. Get ready. We're having a screening in an hour." They held up the screening for 2 hours because Dustin, they couldn't fix him. They had to pluck his eyebrows. They had to shade his nose, and they finally had to hide his weird neck. That's what they called it, in a turtleneck. And then Dustin says it went downhill from there. He was real nervous, and he did something stupid, but he thought it would lighten the mood. He pinched Catherine Ross's rear end and laughed, hoping she would think it was a joke and it would relax her. Well, she whirled around and got right into his face and screamed, "How dare you! Don't you ever think of doing that again, and don't you ever touch me again." Well, hours went by and they were awful. They hated each other. He just wanted to go back to Macy's. That's all he wanted. His last humiliation was while he was saying goodbye to the crew, which were the only people who were talking to him. He pulled his hand out of his pocket to shake some hands, and a fistful of subway tokens fell out, tinkling all over the ground. Everyone laughed like hell as a prop man picked up all the coins and said, "Here, kid, you're going to need these." He flew back home, thought he'd never hear from anyone in Hollywood ever again. Next day, the agent calls up and says, you got to give Mike Nichols a phone call. It's like, oh God, why? Picks up the phone, calls Mike, and he hears the most beautiful words ever spoken in the English language. Well, you got the part. Anne Bancroft was in. Mike also got Simon and Garfunkel music, and that's how the movie got going. But everybody did think it was a terrible story. But it just got so quirky, and the art direction and the director, the way he lined up each shot, it became a magnificent success. And I have to admit, I loved it when I saw it. I thought it was so romantic. But at the core, it's a horrible story. Mrs. Robinson is a criminal. And at least in the Mrs. Robinson song, it sounds like she's in a rehab center or in jail. So that's good. I mean, and that was in the movie. I never even heard those lyrics. Never put two and two together. I just thought it was a great movie. But I'm not as alone as I thought I was. Everyone in Hollywood thought it was a horrible, sick premise too. But here it is 50 years later or more, and it's a classic. So it just goes to show you can make a silk purse out of a sow's ear if you have a great director, great casting, great music, and just great casting. I mean, Catherine Ross, I couldn't take my eyes off of her. She was gorgeous. But anyway, I'm not as crazy as I thought, because the world did think it was sick, and it is so sick. Do not go back. Don't revisit old films that you loved. 99% of the time, they're just going to get you down. This is worse than Dr. Zhivago, actually. So just word to the wise, if you want to remain sane, don't do what I'm doing, okay? And I will be back. Just stay away from everything you ever loved. Leave it alone. It's perfect in the rear view mirror. Just leave it all back there. Don't even think about it. Just remember how happy you were. Okay? And I'll be back. Bye-bye.